Okay, so my name is Paul Kingston. I'm the director of the Center for Critical Development Studies, and it's the center that is hosting our Critical Hope lecture today. So first of all, we'll have a much more worthy introduction in a moment, but I just want to thank Dr. Lima for coming all the way from Rio de Janeiro, and two of her colleagues in addition, but it's a pleasure to have you here. And thank you so much. We're really looking forward, feeling privileged and looking forward to your talk. I also want to thank the undergrads and graduate students and other faculty who've been able to come to our talk today. I just want to take a couple of minutes and give you a little bit of a background to the origins of this lecture series. And this is the second of what is an annual lecture in the Center for Critical Development Studies. So why do we call this the lecture on critical hope? Well, the first reason is that when our center was created, we decided to create it with the name Critical Development Studies instead of what is the standard name for development studies programs across Canada, which is International Development Studies, a bit more generic. But we thought it was important to emphasize a critical perspective right at the very beginning of the program. And we have continued to attract fantastic students academically, a very interesting and diverse array of students. As you all know from looking around the room, it's very exciting as teachers and professors to be able to teach such an interesting and diverse array of students. And we also, I think, have a lot of students who are very active, have very social justice sort of orientation, and are really interested in changing the world for the better, the world that they find around them. But there's a challenge in coming into a development studies program that has a critical orientation if you really are interested in action, because a lot of what we teach pedagogically in our classes is the challenges of and the problematic nature in which international development has operated since really, I suppose, the Second World War, or if we go even before, colonial development schemes. Operated with problems of power relations, the stronger deciding, creating their own agendas oriented by their own ideological orientations of what progress means, and in many ways imposing those power relations, that power and those ideologies in other parts of the world. And so our students are introduced to these more challenging perspectives right from the beginning of their classes. And it can be, and I think we know as faculty within critical development studies, it can be very disorienting for our students who come into this program wanting to make a difference, but realizing it's not so difficult to know how one goes about doing that. So the question is, what do we do about this as faculty? Can be very disorienting and discouraging. And I would like to do a shout out or point out we've had one member, not of development studies, but of the health studies, who took initiative very quietly over the last number of years, recognized that her students were struggling even with their positions in development studies. Can I stay in this program given such a problematic history? And started to create reading groups. And there was resonance among students for those reading groups on the theme of critical hope, how to be a critical scholar, but also to think about taking action in the world. And these reading groups were organized year after year, and they have provided exactly the inspiration for why we have created this lecture. We think that this is a way for students who are entering into this field, want to make a difference, but are challenged by the, both scholarly critical perspectives, but also of the reality of their worlds. How can they actually go about making a difference? So I'd first like to just say thank you to Dr. Suzanne Sicchia, who's sitting right up front. Maybe you could stand up. I'm going to embarrass you. Really, this lecture is a result of your grassroots efforts and your empathy and your interest in the welfare of your students. And I want to thank you very much for giving the inspiration for this lecture series. Again, this will be a permanent institution within CCDS for many, many years to come. I just wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to where this lecture series has come from. And I will now go and sit down and enjoy the lecture, and I will ask Professor, I have one more thing to do. I'll ask Professor Anne-Emmanuelle to come up and introduce our speaker, but I would also like to thank very much Anne-Emmanuelle for doing so much work in coordinating, in finding our wonderful speaker in the first place and suggesting that Dr. Lima come, and just in making sure that the lecture is just so well organized. Thank you very much, Anne-Emmanuelle.
It is an enormous honor to introduce Dr. Nícia Trindade Lima this afternoon. Dr. Lima is the president of Fiocruz, the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, which is a semi-autonomous public institution under Brazil's Ministry of Health. It's the leading health science and technology institution in Latin America, responsible for everything from population health writ large to R&D and production of vaccines, with Biomanguinhos, the world's largest manufacturer of yellow fever vaccine, among others, pharmaceutical creation for Brazil's unified health system, lab and clinical research, primary healthcare delivery to local favelas, public health education to reference hospitals overseeing regional institutes across Brazil, in Mozambique, and a lab in Antarctica, with a workforce of over 11,000 people. Wow. In fact, Dr. Lima's arrival in Toronto yesterday morning coincided with Brazil's first case of coronavirus, and Fiocruz is responsible for coordinating the country's preparedness and response. Had this occurred a few days earlier, it might even have been cause to interrupt the famed carnival celebrations. Instead, we interrupt Dr. Lima's enjoyment of Rio Carnival and 40-degree weather with our own snowflake samba. Dr. Lima trained as a political scientist and sociologist and has a distinguished career as a scholar of Brazilian science and social thought, the history of public health knowledge, and intellectual and geographic representations of Brazil's hinterland. While I could not possibly review her countless publications, you can see that her CV is a tome in and of itself. I wish to emphasize one of my favorites, which is a critical history of Brazil's collective health movement, Abrasco. You can think of it as people's public health, and it emerged under Brazil's dictatorship some 40 years ago, when public represented an authoritarian state and demanded an alternative to truly represent the needs of ordinary people. A sentiment certainly echoed in the current uprisings around Wet'suwet'en and Indigenous sovereignty here in Canada. In addition to being a longtime professor and chair of the Casa Oswaldo Cruz Institute of History of Health Sciences, Dr. Lima also headed Fiocruz's scholarly press and served as the vice president of training, education, and communication. In late 2016, she was elected president of Fiocruz. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with university and scientific institute governance in Latin America, I pause to explain that leadership is democratically elected by faculty and staff, and at some institutions, even students. So U of T's closed leadership, and the governing council is meeting as we speak, they might take heed of a crucial South-North example worthy of emulation. Dr. Lima's installation as Fiocruz president was auspicious on multiple fronts. She is the first woman president in a 120-year history, the first non-MD, so social sciences students all should take note of this, and her presidency was the fruition of a concerted social struggle. Although she won the election by a landslide, Brazil's interim right-wing Temer government quietly approved another candidate. Widespread indignation at this violation of democratic processes led thousands of Fiocruz workers and allies to take to the streets, and in the case of international solidarity, to online petitions, in order to protest this act amid the New Year holidays. The mobilization was successful, and the government was forced to reverse its decision. as evidenced through the moving and hope-inspiring live stream of her inauguration. This was a victory in lessons not only for Brazilian public health, but for us all in acts of solidarity. Since assuming the presidency, Dr. Lima has been committed to expanding Fiocruz's involvement in global health. In addition to a range of historical networks, this has involved close involvement with WHO's action plan around health systems research and country-led priority setting, the Zika Alliance Network, an observatory on climate change and health, and the implementation of the Nairobi Summit, marking the 25th anniversary of the Cairo International Conference on Population and Development, where 179 governments adopted a landmark program of action which set out to empower women and girls for their sake and for the benefit of families, communities, and nations. On a personal note, I have known Nizia for some 25 years. In fact, she was the very first person to welcome me on my very first trip to Brazil for a conference Fiocruz was hosting with the Pan American Health Organization, where I worked at the time, on the future of public health education. That early interaction at a restaurant overlooking Rio's old quarantine facilities, maybe they will come into use in the coming weeks, helped seal a wonderful friendship and work relationship with multiple colleagues, especially Professor Gilberto Hochman, who is also here. You want to wave to everyone? And which has endured both aspirational eras and less propitious political times. Collaborating with Fiocruz scholars over the past quarter century on the history of global health, WHO's efforts around the societal determinants of health, South-South health cooperation, joint conferences, publications, and student training, as well as the establishment of a proto-digital database on the history of health in the Americas, has been a great privilege of my own career. Let me just conclude this introduction by sharing with you Fiocruz's guiding principles, and here I quote, "To promote health and social development, generate and disseminate scientific and technological knowledge, and be an agent of citizenship." These principles are consistent with the motif of our annual Critical Hope lecture. Inaugurated, as we heard, 3 years ago by Professor Suzanne Sikia, who's so attuned to the challenges our students face in deeply analyzing the asymmetrical politics, inequities, and oppression characterizing the mainstream international development studies field, this lecture seeks to connect with Brazilian educator activist Paulo Freire's invocation of the idea of critical hope. In the words of Freire, to whom both Professor Sikia is connected via her friendship with his grandchildren, and Dr. Lima through her own anchoring in Freirean wisdom and action in her upbringing during Brazil's dictatorship. And here I quote, "Without a minimum of hope, we cannot so much as start the struggle. But without the struggle, hope, as an ontological need, dissipates, loses its bearings, and turns into hopelessness. And hopelessness can become tragic despair. Hence, the need for a kind of education in hope." I'm truly delighted to welcome Dr. Lima to UTSC and to bring us critical hope.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to be here. I would like first to thank Dr. Professor Paul and Emmanuel for so warm introduction and to make me feel how important it is to be here in a program with this approach, critical hope. This is inspiration for me and for. So, I appreciate with great satisfaction the invitation made to me by Professor Paul Kingston, Director of the Center for Critical Development Studies of the University of Toronto, to deliver this lecture. I would also like to thank Professor Prof.Birn, historian, with so many contributions to the study of health history in Latin America, and, as she mentioned, with whom I have been sharing various activities throughout my academic life, and at the same time, the commitment with public health and democracy. Ana Manuel is a member of the advisory board of the Postgraduation Internationalization Program of the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, Fiocruz. And this visit will certainly also bring important contributions to the institutional initiative. It is also important to note that, along with my colleagues, Luiz Augusto Galvão, here, from the Global Health Center of Fiocruz, and Gilberto Ortmann, coordinator of Postgraduation Internationalization Program, we are certain that this visit will reinforce the bonds that historically unite our institutions. The satisfaction to which I refer is even greater for knowing that the Critical Hope Program is inspired by Paulo Freire, especially his work, Pedagogy of Hope. According to Freire, we needed to sorry. Where is the okay. Sorry. Okay. The satisfaction to which I refer is even greater for knowing that Critical Hope program is inspired by Paulo Freire, especially his work Pedagogy of Hope. According to Freire, we need to be able to critique the world as it is, while retaining hope for a different future. So, hope is a word that means action, action for change world. He was one of the exponents of a current of critical thinking that emerged in Brazil and the other Latin American countries between the 1940s and 1960s, from different ideological perspectives, and that included militants from the Communist Party, progressive sectors of the Catholic Church, which Freire was close to, and scientists and intellectuals without ties to political organizations, but with a strong critical perspective on the societies where they operate, and on the other, and on the global order. He also among the authors whose trajectory was marked in Brazil by institutional experiences of intense contact with social inequalities in different cultural contexts, and after the military coup of 1964, by the harsh experience of exile. It was also Cold War period. We have to mention to think about this. In the context of publishing his first works, Freire's texts were part of a broader movement that focused on the critique of the capitalist development models then underway, and the criticism of the concept of development itself, a criticism that was expressed in different works and that would also be present at the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, held in Stockholm in 1972, when the concept of sustainable development was established. Since its most systematic formulation at the Stockholm Conference, the concept of sustainable development has received contributions for different critical perspectives that emphasize predatory patterns of consumption of natural resources, poverty and inequalities as important obstacles to the implementation of a development agenda. The lecture will initially address the contributions of two Brazilian authors, the economist Celso Furtado and the physician and geographer Josué de Castro, authors who have in common with Paulo Freire the origin in the Northeast and the critical reflection on this Brazilian region, perceived from the 1950s as a territory of underdevelopment and possibly the one peasant revolution, very common in this time, this kind of idea. Both authors also had their trajectory marked by exile, like Freire. In the second part of my presentation, I will mention the importance of this critical perspective to address in the face of major contemporary challenges around the environment issue, demographic changes, and scientific and technological changes, with their implications for quality of life, health, and sociability. This set of issues is related to a central theme for the development agenda: social inequalities between and within countries. In view of this situation, it is imperative to question the scope of the 2030 Agenda, synthesis goal for sustainable development. No one left behind. So, to think about critical development agenda, recent literature on development and decolonization is extensive, especially among authors who defend the critical perspective of post-colonialism. For this discussion, I think it is important to bring the contribution of a thought that aims at criticizing the development models defended since the Second World War by Brazilian and Latin American authors. The two researchers that I will briefly address here contribute to the establishment of a critical view on the theory of modernization. For this theory, it was a question of identifying paths that would allow countries that were considered underdeveloped to take off for the new condition of development. For Brazilian authors, what those other authors conceptualize as development is what really generated underdevelopment. Therefore, underdevelopment was not an indicator of delay, a primitive stage that should be overcome, but really it was the product of a development model. It's a change of perspective, very important. So, the first author I will mention is Celso Furtado, who was a Brazilian economist and thinker who concluded his doctorate in Paris in 1948 with the thesis The Brazilian Colonial Economy in the 16th and 17th centuries, from which he would write in 1957 his masterpiece, Economic Formation in Brazil. In 1949, Furtado became director of the Development Division of Economic Commission for Latin America, where he remained until 1957, collaborated with the Argentine economist Raul Prebisch in the design of a structuralist approach to Latin American socio-economic reality. In 1962, he was the first holder of the newly created Ministry of Planning in Brazil, but his political rights were revoked during the military regime, and he then began to dedicate himself to research and teaching in many countries. With the redemocratization, he returned to occupy state positions such as Minister of Culture, and continued to collaborate with teaching and research. His economic thinking has the great merit in combining economic and historical approaches. In this year, 2020, in Brazil, some intellectuals and institutions will celebrate his 1st century of birth, organizing challenges seminars. And I will take part of one of them. I will talk briefly about two contributions of Celso Furtado. economic formation of Brazil, and the second, development and underdevelopment. So as the quotation highlight, and I would like to stress here, in development and in development, the follow idea. What characterizes development is the underlying social project. Growth, as we know it, is based on the preservation of the privileges of the elites who satisfy their desire for modernization. When the social project gives priority to the effective improvement of the living conditions of the majority of the population, growth is metamorphosed in development. Now, this metamorphosis does not happen spontaneously. It is the result of the implementation of a project, an expression of a political will. So this book, Development and Underdevelopment, was very important at that time and inspired many other works in Brazil. And the last book that I mentioned by Celso Furtado, The Myth of Economic Development, wrote in 1974. I think that's very important because this line of economists thinking, not only think about development, but also about reducing the waste, change the way of the economy and the way of life at the same time. So as is highlighting this quotation, the new development orientation would have to be in a much more egalitarian sense, reducing the waste caused by the extreme diversification of the current pattern of private consumption of the privileged groups. So it's a very close idea, and the idea of change culture, not only economy, but also change culture. I think that's a very important point for think about development in the way that Critical Hope, the program here, is thinking. I think that is very important to reaffirm this. Well, the second author I would like to mention here is Josué de Castro. Josué de Castro studied medicine in Bahia and Rio de Janeiro, Bahia in Northeast, in the Rio de Janeiro, that time capital of the country, and began to practice medicine in Recife, Pernambuco, when he was born. He promoted the first survey of the living conditions of workers in Recife, a study that served as basis for other states and that served as a force for setting minimum wages in Brazil and recognizing works in the 1930s. In 1942, he was elected the president of the Brazilian Society of Nutrition and created the Social Security Food Service. He became known worldwide when he published the books Geography of Hunger and Geopolitics of Hunger, translated into 24 languages. The first book, Geography of Hunger, has a very interesting quotation. Half of humanity does not eat, and the other half does not sleep, afraid of the ones who do not eat. So I think that the idea of course, there were before Josué de Castro, many authors wrote books and the articles about hunger, about drought in Northeast region, but to put the hunger as a political result of a development model is a characteristic of Josué de Castro thinking. And that was I would like to reinforce here. It's interesting to mention that he was elected president of the Council of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And after, from 1955 to 1963, he served as federal representative for Pernambuco for the Brazilian Labour Party, and resigned to take the post of Brazilian ambassador to the UN in Geneva. He then resigned during the military coup of March of 1964, again. Né? So, Paulo Freire, Celso Furtado, Josué de Castro, and many other Brazilians professors and Brazilian scientists, having his political rights revoked in the same year. He fought until his death for the International Association for the Fight Against Hunger, and died in Paris during exile at the age of 65. He couldn't come back as Paulo Freire and as Celso Furtado could. He could go back to Brazil, sorry. So I think that it's very important to mention that Josué de Castro took part in the conference of Stockholm, and there he presented a work about development and underdevelopment. So in that conference, he highlighted the following points. Underdevelopment is not, as many mistakenly think, insufficient or lack of development. Underdevelopment is a product, a byproduct of development, an inevitable derivation of colonial or neocolonial economic exploration, which continues to be exercised over different regions of the planet. So I think that's a very interesting work, and one of the discussions during the Conference of Stockholm was exactly the problem of the inequalities among nations, among the different countries. This conference was preceded by the publication of The Silent Spring from Rachel Carson and The Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome. The main themes of the conference were related to the physical environment, mainly pollution, deforestation, and marine environment. But social problems and the underdevelopment were also discussed, as I mentioned about the work by Josué de Castro. Since 1972, other crucial global conferences and documents were organized. Rio 92 and the Agenda 21, the Millennium Development Declaration, the Rio Plus 20, and the document The Future We Want. And finally, in 2015, Sustainable Development Summit and the 2030 Agenda and its no Sustainable Development Goals. It is difficult to think today to talk about environment without considering the importance of addressing unsolved global equity and justice problems, such as the respect for the land and the culture of the original populations, the historical debt with the aggressive forms of economic development and its consequences, such as the loss of biodiversity, the pollution of the global water and the soil resources, and the climate change. As the official discussions and the actions move slowly and without the sense of urgency required by those that are directly affected, many civil society initiatives have been established, such as the climate justice, a movement to frame the climate change historically as an ethical, equity, social, and political issue, and not only as environmental and physical aspects. Climate justice assumes that those who are least responsible for climate change suffer its gravest consequence at the global and local levels. By adopting the 2030 Agenda with its 17 SDGs and the Paris Agreement, member states of the United Nations have created a framework for national action and global cooperation on sustainable development. The SDGs focus on time-bound targets for prosperity, people, planet, peace, and partnership, known as the 5Ps. The Paris Agreement commits countries to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emission by the middle of the century. The 23rd Agenda pledges that no one will be left behind in implementing the SDGs. This principle of equity and fairness aims to overcome inequalities and discrimination. There is an important point related to the commitment of countries. Otherwise, the proposal announced in the agenda contrasts with the global reality, the inequalities in the world, and within national societies. The first challenge I will mention is climate change challenge. While climate change is one of the biggest threats of the moment, it can also worsen the conditions of many other environmental determinants of health related to unequal social conditions of a society. Indoor and ambient air pollution affects more the children and the elderly than other age groups. In rural areas, indoor air pollution affects more women and children, who also are burdened by the extra everyday work to look for water for the families, which sometimes are very far and demand long walks, keeping children from studying. In the impoverished periphery of the urban areas, the lack of safe drinking water, the high level of air pollution, the higher risk of road and personal safety, the exposure to unsafe disposal of solid and hazardous wastes, and the lack of access to basic sanitation cause a disproportional incidence of diseases. It is, in fact, a human rights problem. The numbers from WHO are alarming and point out that environmental risks are responsible for at least 13 million deaths each year. Air pollution causes 7 million preventable deaths per year. More than half the world's population is still exposed to unsafe water, inadequate sanitation, and poor hygiene, resulting in more than 800,000 preventable deaths each year. A large fraction of malaria cases and the other vector-borne diseases are linked to environmental issues, such as drainage, irrigation, and energy. At least 1 million workers die because of unsafe work conditions, and more than 1 million people die from exposure to chemicals. So I think that is a very important point in our agenda, and nowadays related to many dimensions of society. The second challenge I'd like to mention is the gender equality challenge. In 2018, the UNFPA's annual State of World Population report titled The Power of Choice explored how rights and choice, of a lack of them, influence women, couples, families, and countries' prospects for economic and social progress. And Emmanuel had mentioned before our commitment at Fiocruz with the Nairobi Agenda. I'd like to reinforce this point and some evidence about this important commitment and the challenge represented for this agenda. While different population groups may face discrimination around the world, and these groups may vary among countries, discrimination against women is universal. The United Nations Women on Gender Equality and Inclusive Growth indicates that in 40 countries, women were the ones more likely to live on less than half the median income. Let me add that gender equitable inclusive growth should be understood in terms of transforming the lives of both women and men, so that each one participates equally in paid and unpaid work, and each one has an income of their own and free time. This means working to address the negative social, cultural, policy, and legal barriers that hold women, girls, and the other marginalized groups back. The unequal power dynamics that underpin discrimination and violence are the most fundamental ones. Recent UNFPA data from 45 countries shows that only half of married women can safely negotiate decisions about sexual relations, contraception, and reproductive health care. It's very serious. When it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights, young people, people with disabilities, indigenous people, racial and ethnic minorities, and the persons with diverse sexual orientation face persistent inequalities and stigma in countries around the world. And again, we see these inequalities everywhere. Across a diversity of countries in the Western Hemisphere, for example, Afro-descendant women are likely to suffer pregnancy-related complications and more likely to die in childbirth than other women. They are also disproportionately represented among domestic workers and the other unstable informal jobs. I will show briefly data about this topic in Brazil. Maternal mortality rate in Brazil by race estimated for 2017 is incredible. The difference between white, brown, black, native population. This is statistical official classification. I have no time to explore more this topic. The idea of brown, black is considered in official Brazilian statistics, but show clearly the discrimination, the inequality in a very, very high, in a very expressive form. Well, I mentioned data and the conclusion presenting the Human Development Report published by 2019 by the United Nations Development Programme. And the third challenge that I will mention now is demographic challenge. The changing inequality in life expectancy, low women development countries catch up in life expectancy at birth, but lagging behind in life expectancy at older age. So that's a very interesting graphic because it shows that the rhythm of change is very different from the idea of exactly the basis. So the low woman development countries catching up in the expectancy at birth, but when we look at the older age, the graphic changed completely. So it's very interesting because you have this change all in the world, especially in low income countries, but low human development countries, but you don't have the same result when we think about the age. Now, after 70, the inequalities are very, very expressive. At the same time, we have the reduction in child mortality, but again, it's not so expressive in low human development countries. So, when we think about educational challenge, the fourth challenge that you mentioned, we see a very similar process. We can see that the basic education, the primary education, we have a very improvement in the low and the middle income countries, but when we could see the third level of education, the graphic change again, a kind of mirror, they change again. So that's the point that I would like to highlight here. Yeah? And after I will give the slides for more deep consult, because now the time is not good to many details. But that's the point that I think that's important. So, when I would like to go to the 5 challenges: science, technology, and innovation challenge. The global asymmetries on knowledge creation, innovation, and the national productive structure are critical to understand why some countries have been lagging behind. A sustainable development agenda where no one is left behind demands consider the complex social, territorial, economic, and scientific dimensions of inequality and how it affects innovation and development. The Human Development Index is one of the most used indicators to reveal the socioeconomic context of countries, despite its limitation, specifically because this index doesn't deal with the inequality within the countries. Slide 13 shows that the asymmetries between the global north and the global south are still significant, as most of the global south, especially the African countries, is behind. Some countries of the global south were able to accelerate their growth in the last decades and catch up with developed countries in economic and technological terms. However, if these countries are still lagging behind in socioeconomic terms compared to developed countries. Another critical issue is that since the 1980s, inequality between the rich and the poor rose in almost every country in the world, reflecting new political, economic, and societal changes. The inequality adjusted Human Development Index indicates the human development cost of inequality within countries. Slide 14 evidences the significant impact of inequality in the Human Development Index of countries, especially in the Global South. If you compare the two maps, you can see the difference. Now, here we can see the points of inequalities in a more clear form. The territory is another important dimension of inequality. The slide 15 shows that there are significant difference between regions. And of course, my example is Brazil, with a country, especially in continental countries like Brazil. Now we can see the important difference, the global asymmetries, the strong blue, the more developed countries, the light blue, the less developed parts in terms of the human development. Moreover, it's noticeable that states with lower per capita income show high inequality index, suggesting that global asymmetries are reproduced in the regional and sub-regional levels. I argue that there is a global asymmetry situation that excludes countries, regions, and populations from access to human rights, evidenced in an international division of labor in which some countries become mere consumers of technology, while others define, not only produce, but define the global technological pattern, exercising a geopolitical domain that reproduces asymmetries. Greater democratization in the generation of scientific knowledge in less developed countries, and Brazil had a very important way trying to do this, is essential to bring research closer to the needs of less developed countries and regions. There is a pressing need for research networks to be more symmetrical and equitable in defining problems, objects, research protocols, and their translation to the society. Patents are one indicator of these profound asymmetries, referring not only to innovative capacities, but at the same time to the restrictions in access of products. So is the global asymmetries, intellectual property. When you see the color is stronger, the brick is stronger, is related to the most important countries in terms of intellectual property. And again, it's not an index of creativity, of course it is, but at the same time is an index of restriction to the access for the poor. The context of profound transformation in the ways of generating knowledge and organizing society depends the risk that more countries, regions, and people falling behind. The next slide shows that the leading developers of artificial intelligence today are China, USA, Japan, South Korea, and the countries of the European Union. In this case, including the UK, before the Brexit. Before the Brexit, okay? So it's another example of this concentration of knowledge and, of course, of power. I use as an important source for these considerations the Human Development Report, published in 2019. Let me now talk about some of its main conclusions. The main conclusions of the Human Development Report, I highlight two conclusions, are this. While many people are stepping above minimum floors of achievement in human development, widespread disparities remain. And the second conclusion, a new generation of severe inequalities in human development is emerging, even if many of the unresolved inequalities of the 20th century are declining. So the life expectancy, for example, is related to better life conditions, and this time with the so-called Revolution 4.0, with more access of new medicines and so on, that will be, we can affirm this, make larger the difference between the rich and the poor. I argue that it is not enough that people step above minimum floors of achievement in human development. We need to face the problem of inequality. So there is an approach that highlights the point of reduced poverty. And I argue that it's not enough. You have to reduce poverty, but at the same time, we need to face the problem of inequality. We also need to say that inequality, of course, is not a natural construction, but a socio-historical one. And more, inequality is not always seen as injustice. With the transformation in work market, Increase of informal jobs, among other problems, relate to the so-called Revolution 4.0 and society of information. These problems will be more severe. And inequality is increasing. It is important to remember that the richest 1% of the world population has the same wealth as the other 90%. Only the 8 richest billionaires in the world have the same as the poorest half of the world's population. You have to remember Josué de Castro about hunger. No? The perception of inequality and the sense of injustice is a very important topic for our agenda. A recent movie shows the social tension and the problems related to inequalities, and the social, not only the inequalities, but at the same time is the social perception about them. Parasite, the winner of the Oscar for the Best Picture, recent. Now, so I don't know if everybody could see the picture. It's very interesting, but show exactly a very acute social tension and the perception of the difference. According to the 2019 Human Development Report of the United Nations, in South Korea, the movies about South Korea, the social inequality is greater than that of several developed countries. But, for instance, it is much lower than countries like Brazil. However, the social tension is intense and appears in unusual indicators in the reports of social organizations, such as the perception of smell. The movie, very important aspect is the smell of poor people. The smell of people is a very challenging theme about the construction of social difference and cultural difference. So I would like to show an example of an interesting study. This is a study about recognition in algorithms, the use of algorithms. So on the left, we have the sink, a sink in a poor family, and on the right, we have a soap, modern soap, very hygienic atmosphere, and so on. It's very funny because it's the study, the people use the very different sites, Google, Amazon, and so on. So you can see on the left, the algorithm could recognize this object as soap, recognize as food, as cheese, as bread, as sandwich. It's not soap. Incredible, incredible. And on the left, no. On the left is, of course, is soap, food, bathroom, accessory. No? So what this kind of study? This study was published. I forget to mention the source, but I can. It was a study published. I can give you after the reference complete. Is very interesting because they show this cultural difference. And what's the most important point, I think that algorithms of recognition systems have a hard time interpreting common items in low-income countries. The percentage of error in recognition increases as households' income decreases. For items in the United States of America, for instance, recognition is up to 20% higher than the same objects in poorer countries. Possible causes. Developers are generally higher educated and from high-income countries or high-level society. And the point here is that while our recognition algorithm systems were able to recognize the soap used in developed countries, they couldn't recognize the soap used in underdeveloped countries, or in the low social classes. And it's very important to think, because it's about soap, but you can think about many other things. And I put soap exactly because of the parallel with the movie Parasite, because the soap is very important in the atmosphere constructed in the film. The important dimension aqui that is algorithm not only create this kind of thing, but reproduce the difference, and it make us to think about the neutral characteristic of the technology of information. It's not neutral, but this example, I think that is very impressive in this way. Well, these are the multiple dimensions of inequalities I tried to share in this lecture. Of course, we have many other dimensions. Thinking about critical hope, I sought inspiration in the critical tradition of Brazilian thought about development and inequality, especially mentioned by Celso Furtado and Josué de Castro. It is important to reduce poverty, but at the same time, it is important to reduce inequality, promoting public universal policies in fields such as education, health, among others. Greater democratization in the generation of scientific knowledge in less developed countries is also essential to bring research closer to the needs of less developed countries and regions. And we need social participation, that's a very important aspect, and a democratic process for this kind of achievements. So as conclusion, I'd like to highlight this idea. If you are serious about leaving no one behind, we need to work harder to address inequalities. Thank you very much.